السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Gems of the Heart, where we look into our hearts closely as an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify it. This heart, as it's always repeated, and we need to be always reminded to make sure that we need to work on our hearts. And when we say we work on our hearts, this is a mandatory thing, because we need to purify it, we need to adorn it. Two things when it comes to the heart. We need to purify it and remove all kinds of evil actions, false beliefs, anything that is attached to the heart that is evil or deficient or weakness or whatever there is that is false and weak and so on, and to adorn and to beautify the heart with what is pure. So it's really two jobs, two major ones, and the details of it is basically the deen of Islam. So that can never be achieved unless a person has the proper knowledge, because the only way for us to do that is through the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So how can we purify our hearts? How can we adorn our hearts? Is by the way of the Prophet ﷺ, learning what's in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And we've been going through matters of belief, matters of aqidah, matters of faith, and how this is the foundation for any purity or any purification to the hearts or any adornment to the hearts. It can never be achieved unless we have the proper belief, the proper faith, to increase our iman, to complete our iman. That's why the faith of al-iman, something that we need to keep on reminding ourselves, establishing it in our hearts, so that everything else in our life becomes easy for us to establish. Whether it's manners, whether it's rulings, to stay away from haram, all of these things, if it's not based on matters of al-iman and faith, it becomes a very difficult thing. Why would someone control his desire, the sinful one, for what reason? Unless it's because of the love of Allah, the fear of Allah, hoping for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having the hearts attached to the hereafter. This is how we establish matters of the deen. But when a person neglects what's in their hearts, and they start doing physical actions without really relating it to how it's supposed to be from our hearts, without the love of Allah, without the fear, the hope, without sincerity, truthfulness, what's the benefit of these actions? There's no benefit of it. So this is the foundation of all goodness, and we need to do these two major things, and that is to purify ourselves and to adorn ourselves from what is beautiful. And we're still talking about matters of al-iman, matters of faith, pillars of al-iman. The first pillar of al-iman, which is the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if there is anything that will purify our hearts and adorn our hearts, it's not going to be anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the creator of all things. He's the one that guides. He's the one that bestows His mercy to whoever and upon whoever He wills subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the most important mean for us to have this in our life is to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the right way. And to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the right way, we have to follow the revelation from Allah, the Quran, and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And we talked about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His rububiyyah, that He's the Lord of the Alameen. We talked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the only one worthy of worship, and how that purifies and adorns the hearts. And we've been talking about the names and attributes of Allah. One of the very important and the very effective ways to purify our hearts and to adorn it, actually, is not just one of the effective way, it's the effective way. It's the way to achieve the adorning of our hearts and to purify our iman and to establish it in our hearts, is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, as it's mentioned in the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So every name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and every attribute of Allah needs to have our attention, for us to believe in it, to learn the meanings of it, and to act according to it. And that we would see very clearly in our life, how in our beliefs and actions and interactions with others, how to implement the effect of these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It makes life easy, gives us a totally different perspective of how to be a true and a good Muslim, how to submit ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, makes us see things in the real way and form that will protect us from being deceived from this life, to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. All of that when we get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. And we've talked about many of the names and attributes of Allah, one of which is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hakam. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam. And Al-Hakam comes from hukm or judgment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the judge of all. The one that we need to establish this in our life, that He is Al-Hakam. He is the judge. Anything that happens on the face of earth is a manifestation of this attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He rules, and nobody can change the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this has two meanings to it. There is the universal rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He rules over the universe and all that exists. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belongs to Him everything. That He has the sovereignty of the heavens and the earth. That the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala overpowers anything. And this is in the universal sense. And no one whatsoever in the creation of Allah, they have the power or even the means or whatever to change the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a creation of Allah. He's the one that created them. So how can they change anything when they already lack it by default, by being a creation? As we mentioned before, which very easy and it's not something that is deep philosophical issue. It's a very simple, straightforward matter. As the ulama they mentioned. If you are makhluk, if you are a creation of Allah, what is by default you are? You are faqir. You are in need of Allah. So al-faqr, or to be in need of Allah, is as they say, wasf dhati lazim. This is something in your being. This is something that it never escape you. It's always present in you. You would never have a moment in this life or in the hereafter that you become in no need, for example, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no such a thing, because He's the one that created you. That means you are in constant need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being Al-Ghani, being the most rich, He does not need anything, because He's the creator of all things. So when we have this established in our hearts, then who's the one that has the ruling over everything? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why we see the creation of the human beings. This is the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He created us from nothing. We don't have a say. This is all by the decision of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ruled the matter, and the matter is over. The same thing how we live our life, the aqdar, the destiny of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who dies and who is born, and affairs of the people, and the rise and falls of nations and so on. Everything is by the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ways that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes on the face of earth that affects the lives of the people, all of that is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fact that this life will vanish, will finish, that's by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The day of judgment, when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen, all of that is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the day of judgment, nobody will have a say who will be in Jannah, who will be in hellfire, by the justice of Allah. So that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that will judge all of the human beings in the day of judgment. And He's the most just subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the most merciful, and all the different names and attributes of Allah. And nobody will judge in the day of judgment. Nobody has the ability, because they're all creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows what's in the hearts. He knows the physical actions of the people. He knows the whims, the desires, the intentions. Everything is shahada. That means everything is witnessed, is seen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we know that some people on the face of earth, they have some form of power to rule over people. Rulers, judges, parents over their children, an owner of a company over the people that work for him, and so on and so forth. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. And He created us in such a way also for us to reflect that when these things are present in our lives, but when we see the human beings, they are deficient. Even though when they have the power and the means, they give a ruling and they execute it. Right? And we know that many times this is all unjust, because human beings are limited. And that's why when they see, for example, if a judge, if he is the most just judge and the most just ruler ever among the human beings, he's still a human being with the human being limitations that he cannot go beyond that unless it's revealed to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ mentioned something to this fact, that when two people come in a dispute for the Prophet ﷺ to judge between them, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ, indeed I'm a human being. When he rules and judge among them, he's a human being. So he goes but by what is been presented to him. So he said ﷺ, in the meaning of which, that one of you might be more eloquent in his verdict, in his opinion, in his basically evidences that he has and his case, more than his partner or the one that is in dispute with. So the Prophet ﷺ might make the ruling in his favor based on the evidences, and there are rules that governs this. But then the Prophet ﷺ warned that it's not by the judgment of the Prophet ﷺ that means the person is safe, and he would say, the Prophet ﷺ gave me that ruling. If that person is wrong and he knows that he is wrong, it doesn't matter what judge would give him a verdict or a ruling, that means he will continue to be wrong. And as the Prophet ﷺ is saying, as if that person is taking a portion of the fire for himself. So therefore, it's not by what the rulers or the judges or whatever there is on the face of earth when they rule, it doesn't mean that in the day of judgment, this is a final one. So if it's good, if it's upon justice, this is great. But if it's not, there is the day of judgment. And there is the ways of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the face of earth. So we have to, one of the ways to understand the meanings and to affect our hearts with the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to see how, as human beings, we relate to this attribute. And human beings, they have limited rulings. You would find a ruler ruling a specific land, for example, and he has his sovereignty and control over it. And not even every single person he knows, and he knows how to get them and so on. This is the deficiencies of the human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just the ruler and the one that judges between the people in a particular land or a particular place. It's the entire universe, the entire creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So nothing is the like of Allah. So that's why when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam, like the same way with all of the names and attributes of Allah, nothing is the like of Allah. And when we keep on repeating this, we would see how evil and unjust are the human beings when they think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they act towards the rulings from Allah as if they are acting towards the rulings of the human beings. You can deceive a human being, but you cannot deceive Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why the other set of meaning, or the second meaning of Al-Hakam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the judge and the ruler of all, is when it comes to the religious matters. That means the things that we have a choice in, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to the Prophet ﷺ, that these are the orders of Allah. That this is the way to judge and to rule among people. And this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when people apply the orders of Allah, they are being successful, and that's the most perfect way, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just, and He's the most merciful, and so on. And if people turn away from the rulings from Allah and the judgment of Allah, they are basically spreading corruption on the face of earth, spreading injustices on the face of earth, and therefore they subject themselves to the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment upon them, when He subhanahu wa ta'ala warned them from ruling by other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered for the people to observe. So this is a very simple matter for someone that has faith and belief to see it and to establish it in our life. So no one is to overpower the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We see in the Quran there are verses that talks about this, and how that the Prophet ﷺ, he said to the people of Quraysh, and how the believers should have in their hearts, that nobody is to judge after the judgment of Allah is already final. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make a ruling, who can judge after the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the ruling of something, whether it's a punishment in this life or in the hereafter, for a specific crime or for halal and haram, who can come afterwards and overrule the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might allow them on the face of earth, but there is something waiting for them, a severe punishment from Allah when they intervened, or when they thought that they can give a ruling other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ruled. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, said in Surah Al-An'am, verse number 114, أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكِتَابَ مُفَصَّلًا, which means that أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ, is it other than Allah that I should seek as a judge while it is He who has revealed to you the book explained in details? That it's a question that the answer of it is very obvious. There are questions in the Quran that is given to the people not to wait for an answer for them, not because of a lack of knowledge, but to establish a fact that the human being or the reciter of the Quran become, as they say, cornered. There's no other answer than to say none besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be the judge. So this is the only answer. So when you extract the answer from someone, this is much more powerful in debates and establishing the truth than to state it as a fact. And this is clear in the words and the life of the people. For example, if you say that a person, for example, say that he is the president, and if he says to the people, I am the president, it's already a fact. But when he says to them, who is your president? He wants to make a point. Say, for example, he made a decision and he wants people to apply it in their life, but maybe they're not. So he is reminding them, who is your president? If they say, you are our president, right, then it's very obvious afterwards, what does that mean? Does it mean is it a decor job? Just someone to be there and you call him a president? Or he has a job to fulfill? So therefore he has to do something and they have to accept that with the proper rulings of it. So it's a question to extract from them that there is something that comes as a result of their answer. So the same thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the people, to the disbelievers, and where the Prophet ﷺ is supposed to say that to them. أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا, is it other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala I should seek as a hakam, as a ruler, as a judge? And He is the one, while He is the one that brought down to you al-kitab mufassala. The book has been revealed to you in details. So how can I then take other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a judge? And who is the one that revealed the book? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And is the book revealed ambiguous or in general terms only? No, it's perfect. And we can go on with the verses. Right? And that's why when we see the next verse, وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا, that the words of your Lord has been completed with truthfulness, with justice. That's the hukm of Allah, is by the truth and justice. This is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In its rulings and its actions, nobody can change the words of Allah, and He's the All-Hearer, the All-Knower. And even more afterwards, because when people would think that, the norm of the people that they don't do this. If we leave it to the human beings, they don't even apply what is obvious when the question has been asked to them. That's why the next verse, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ, which means that if you obey most of the people on the face of earth, they would lead you astray, away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, you as a believer, being addressed by the orders of Allah, you as a human being, being addressed by the revelation of Allah, by the Quran, you're supposed to apply this in your life. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the judge in your life, with your wealth, with your life, with your breath that you take. He's the one that gave you all of this. So how can He then be not the one that rule over what He gave you? It's a very obvious thing. We're talking about the obvious, by the way. When we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're talking about the obvious, the thing that has no ambiguity in it whatsoever, cannot be denied if a person is at peace with his own self and goes back to his fitrah, to his pure nature. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, isn't He the provider? When He subhanahu wa ta'ala the one that gave you the provisions. If someone gave you something that you don't own, and He gives you whatever He gives you, but with conditions, that I'm giving you this, but you have to apply this and this and this. He has the right. This is His, right? Everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we are owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our life, our wealth, our strength, our health, everything is given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the ruling and the judgment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, if, imagine, don't drink water. He's the provider of the water. So if He give a ruling, never drink water, of course the human beings will die, because this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. And that's not the orders of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not order us to stay thirsty till we die. He's the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the point here is, does He have the right to give such a ruling? Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Al-Hakam. And that's why this is not something invented. It's a way to purify our hearts with these types of questions when we see the obvious. When this is the case, then when it comes to the order of Allah, that it comes into our own benefit in the worldly gain, and of course the hereafter. Isn't it then ought to be from ourselves this full submission to the orders of Allah? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, says, for those who fulfill certain conditions, being wealthy, having enough money to save over a year, the nisab, which is equal to 70 grams of gold, or between 70 and 80, it's already saved, and this is in one portion of the zakah, which is the zakah of gold and silver and the money and so on. To give 2.5% of it, only 25 every 1,000. This is the rules from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Can someone says no? Meaning, of course, people would refuse and they don't pay it, right? But when a person see that this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's full submission. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to give all of our wealth, would we have any choice religiously? Of course not. We have to submit ourselves, because He's the owner of all things subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the ruling that when the time of the salah comes, you need to establish the salah. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع. O you who believe, if the adhan is called in the day of Jumu'ah, فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله, go to the dhikr, to the remembrance of Allah, go to the masjid. For the men to go to the masjid and to attend Salatul Jumu'ah. If the adhan is called, and then He said وذروا البيع, and leave buying and selling becomes haram for you. If Jumu'ah is an obligation for you, then it's haram for you to buy and sell. You cannot buy, you cannot sell once the adhan of Jumu'ah is being called. This is a rule. This is a decision made by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He's given you the choice whether you apply it or not, but there's consequences in not applying the orders of Allah. This is the entire deen of Islam like this, and the entire life of a Muslim. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam. And this is how to purify our hearts, give so much comfort and contentment and happiness. And it makes the person wants to seek knowledge of what are the rulings from Allah so that we apply it. We'll continue inshallah ta'ala because of the time right after the break with more of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hakam, as a way to purify our hearts. So stay with us inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back. And we are talking about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hakam, the judge. And we talked about the two meanings of it. One is universal, nobody has a choice in it whatsoever when it comes to how this universe is governed. It's all by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that judges, and He's the one that's going to judge between the people in the day of judgment, and nobody has a say whatsoever. And the other meaning is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the judge when it comes to all of our affairs in our lives. Our wealth, our health, our time, everything. That's why there are rulings in the Quran, that these rulings in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore we need to apply this in our life because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam. So as a result of that in our life, it has to be clear. We heard the verse in the Quran, and there are verses in the Quran that talks about this. One of which, for example, as we said earlier, it was a question. So another verse in Surah At-Teen, that we all have it memorized. Many of us, we have it memorized, Surah At-Teen. And at the end of the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in it, أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَحْكَمِ الْحَاكِمِينَ. Isn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala أَحْكَمُ الْحَاكِمِينَ, which means the best judge of all judges, the judge of all judges. Ahkam, that's the verb of Al-Hakam, the judge, the one that judge in the best way that all judges can do. because He's the creator of all things. And this is something that is also a question that a believer doesn't find himself but saying, Bala, that indeed, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ahkam al-Hakimin. He is the best of all rulers, He is the best of all judges, and any other judges other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's all creation of Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ahkam al-Hakimin, the most of all judges, of course. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and encouraging him to have patience and to say to the disbelievers when He invited them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they rejected the truth, there's a judgment in the Day of Judgment. We see that so many injustices on the face of earth, many things that are evil, atrocities, oppression, and people die and they don't see that justice in their life, because everybody shall return to Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam. He is the most just subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the one that is going to judge and rule among the people in the Day of Judgment. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to the believers, فَاصْبِرُوا حَتَّى يَحْكُمَ اللَّهُ بَيْنَنَا وَهُوَ خَيْرُ الْحَاكِمِينَ. That be patient till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judge between us, and He is, the first one we heard was أحكم الحاكمين, the most judge of all judges. Here خير الحاكمين, the best of all judges. Nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if it doesn't happen that a person received the justice on the face of earth, it's going to be received perfectly in the Day of Judgment. But then the punishment is something that nobody can escape if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rule the punishment for the person. And we see that in the verses in the Quran that talks about the Day of Judgment. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the one that rules and He's the one that judges, but He subhanahu wa ta'ala established means of this in this life and in hereafter for people to see it. In the Day of Judgment, the people, their parts of their bodies will speak as a witness against them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though He is Al-Hakam, He's the one that judges, and nobody can overrule the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but He bring witnesses, and He make witness against the person or for him or whatever, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. As we will talk about, one of the names of Allah, or one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is Al-Adl, He is the most just. But Al-Hakam is the one that judge, and the rulings is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and it's a sound hadith reported by Imam Abu Dawud and others, that when some of the people came to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam as a delegation, and he heard them saying to someone, calling him Abu Al-Hakam, the father of Al-Hakam, as a kunya, as a nickname, like Abu Ahmad, Abu Abdullah, people using the name of their oldest son as a nickname for them. So they would call him Abu Al-Hakam. So the Prophet ﷺ called that person, and he said to him, correcting that this is not something that is appropriate for him to be named with this, or to give in this kunya to him. He said, Inna Allah huwa al-Hakam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam. He is the judge. Wa ilayhi al-hukm, and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belong the ruling and the judgment. فَلِمَ تُكْنَى بِأَبِ الْحَكَمِ, why you are given, أو تُكَنَّ بِأَبِ الْحَكَمِ, why you are given this kunya, why you are given this nickname to be named Abu Al-Hakam. This is only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ that his people, they disputed about something, so they came to him and he gave them a judgment or a ruling. So they were both pleased by his judgment. He was a wise person, so they liked his judgment, so they called him Abu Al-Hakam. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said that this is something good that you had judged between the people. But then the Prophet ﷺ correcting him and giving him another option. And see, it's an amazing how the Prophet ﷺ would deal with people. Nothing from among the human beings like the Prophet ﷺ. That when the man told him this, he said ﷺ, "Ma ahsana hadha." This is a good thing that you gave a good and a just ruling among the people, and they were pleased with this. But then see what the Prophet ﷺ said. He asked him, فَمَا لَكَ مِنَ الْوَلَدِ, how many sons, or what sons you have in this life. He said, I have Shuraih and Muslim. and Abdullah. This is the names of his children, Shuraih and Muslim and Abdullah. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, who is the eldest among them? He said, Shuraih. So the Prophet ﷺ said to him, then you are Abu Shuraih. You are the father of Shuraih. This is now your new kunya, your new nickname. So people can call you Abu Shuraih. And by the way, this is one of the things, even though this is a cultural thing, but it's a good thing to, even as Muslims, to adopt this culture and this way. And it's not a mandatory thing, of course, but it's a good thing. And it gives a sense of responsibility for even a child to name the child or to give the child of a kunya. So this is a different subject. But the Prophet ﷺ here, he corrected it because he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam. وَإِلَيْهِ الْحُكْمِ, that it comes from Him, initiated from Him, and it ends to be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a ruling, nobody is to oppose or to reject or turn away from the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why, it's when we talk about this meaning, you might hear the word Al-Hakim, or the ruler, or the judge. So we have Al-Hakam and we have Al-Hakim. What is the difference between both? Of course, Al-Hakam is much more powerful. He is not just a temporary one. And it gives the meaning of justice, that he is the judge. Not a ruler might rule with justice or with injustice. But Al-Hakam is the one that rules with wisdom, the ones that rules with justice. And the other meaning is that his judgment is never to be overruled, whether it's universally or when it comes to the religiously, that people should not choose to overrule the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we go back to the verse that we heard earlier, أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا, something that should be the way of our life, something that should be always as if we're saying that constantly. Is it other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or should I take other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a judging ruling for myself? How can I transgress the orders of Allah? How can I go beyond the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because why would I do that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just? His judgment is the most just, and there's no one is more truthful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why would I go to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is such an amazing thing that, again, it's the obvious, that why would someone turn away from what is obvious? So even with the rulings of capital punishments, like cutting the hands of a thief and lashing the one that commits fornication and so on and so forth, this is the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, with the different conditions for it to be established. It's not like some people think it's just a ruling and that's it, and people can apply it the way they like. It's not even like the civil laws that people do when it comes to applying the punishment on a thief and so on. When there's a capital punishment, by the way, and this is some of the essence of the rulings mentioned in the Quran, you would find for it, if it's to be applied, it's very difficult to prove it. Very difficult to prove it, because the evidences has to be beyond doubt whatsoever for that to be established. And that's why, for example, as we know, the ruling for adultery to be established as a crime, it has to be either the person confessing and saying that, acknowledging the matter clearly, or there are 4 witnesses witnessing the act itself, which is a very difficult thing for people to establish as an evidence. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the most wise. He could have made it much, much easier to establish the crime. But it's not the goal of the deen of Allah, but rather actually it's the goal of the rulings from Allah for that type of crime to be hidden, to be concealed, not for people to be exposed. But anyway, if this is a matter that is established like this, then the punishment is accordingly. So it's not about establishing the punishment based on some evidences that people use in courts nowadays, for example. No, it's something that is very different, to make sure that this punishment, even though it's very severe, but it's something that needs more effort to establish it. This is not our subject today to go into the details of that, but even that a Muslim should witness clearly that this is nothing better than this. Why? Because it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the amount of corruption and insecurity and chaos that the universe, that the whole world is living today, One of the reasons for it is because they do not apply the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why you can go anywhere in the world, where people are living together, major cities and so on. If they are temporarily, maybe they are secure at certain times, not at all times. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. And whenever there's a ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to protect the people from the evil within their own selves. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned also in the capital punishment, He mentioned life in the context of giving a ruling to punish someone by the death penalty, for example. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. You have in the retaliation in matters of qisas or capital punishment, you have life in this, because it saves life. It saves lives. When people know that the punishment is severe, they would not apply this in their life. They would not commit these types of atrocities and crimes and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again is the one that is the judge, and comes with this is the justice of Allah, which is another attribute that we will talk about it inshallah ta'ala later. But the point here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everybody will be judged because He is Al-Hakam. So one of the great benefits that nobody will escape the judgment from Allah. You might escape in this life, but nobody will escape from that in the hereafter. Even when a person is dealing with his loved ones, having our own children, to give a judgment or a ruling among them, we have to be just. And this is in the subject of judgment or justice, but you have to give a verdict sometimes. Even if a person thinks that it's something not that important or insignificant, but it's significant to them. Even as one of the early generations of Islam, he put it in such a way that if you have two children, they come to you and they ask you to be a judge between them, who have a better handwriting. Of course, many people, they get out of it by being nice to both. They say, mashallah, both of you have beautiful handwriting. Right? But if you are in a position of giving a judgment, not just to say, oh, mashallah, this is all beautiful. If you are in a position that someone's going to be first place and someone's going to be second place, and there's not major things will happen as a result of this ruling, if you deal with it with anything other than justice, you will be asked about it in the Day of Judgment. So a contest between people, even if it's your own family, right? You have to be just. If you are in the position of being a judge, even if it's something insignificant, we have to be just. And it doesn't mean that you can give prizes to everybody. But the point here is, if you are in the state of being a judge, you have to be just. Of course, there's a much larger and much spacious state that a person can be in, and that is to bring peace among people. There's a dispute in a family, for example, between a husband and a wife. It's a big difference between someone being brought as a judge and someone is being brought to bring peace, among these people. When it comes to bringing peace and rectifying the situation, then you can ask the one that has the right to, forgive when it comes to his right. Forgive others. You're not being a judge, but you're asking to forgive, and from the other side to be lenient and so on, for people to live good, with one another. But if a person is in the position of being a judge, it's a totally different situation. Then a person has to be just, and that's why many of the early generations of Islam, they used to decline the offer of being judges, because the Prophet ﷺ, he said that there are three types of judges. قَاضِيَانْ فِي النَّارِ, two judges are in the hellfire, and one qadi, one judge in Jannah. So that means it's more likely a person is subjected to punishment more than goodness, and people, they have to have a judge between them. Why? And he explained, ﷺ, the one that judges among people without knowledge, somebody has to judge, so he judges among them, and he has no knowledge of it, he's in the hellfire, because that's such an evil one. The second one in the hellfire is the one that judges with knowledge, but he's unjust. And he knows that he's unjust. And he gives the verdict when he's unjust, that means he's in the hellfire. And the only one that will be in Jannah is the one that has the knowledge when he judges among the people, and he is just. So he's applying justice and he has the knowledge of it. So this is a very difficult route, but people are in need of it. And that's why it's one of the positions that a person should not seek to be, but rather it's to be given to those who fit. And therefore, whoever it's given to him because he fits that position, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help him. But someone to have it or seek in it, he might rush to it without having the proper knowledge and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Al-Hakam subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He's the one that we are, all of us, under the ruling of Allah. You know, one of the beautiful dua that the Prophet ﷺ, he taught us, and he said it's important and it's something that is really necessary and important for a person, if he hears this dua, to memorize it and to make people memorize this dua. It's a beautiful dua that many of us have heard it before. In it, this mention of the hukm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has the effect of that in the hearts of the believers, which is the dua, Allahumma inni abduk wa ibnu abdik wa ibnu amatik, nasiyati biyadik, madin fiya hukmuk, adlun fiya qada'uk, as'aluka bi kulli ismin huwa lak, سميت به نفسك أو أنزلته في كتابك أو علمته أحدا من خلقك أو استأثرت به في علم الغيب عندك أن تجعل القرآن ربيع قلبي ونور صدري وجلاء حزني وذهاب همي. This is a beautiful dua that definitely it's something very important for us to know it, to memorize it. And the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever says it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would remove from his heart one of the gems of the heart, to remove from the heart the sadness and the concern and the miseries and the depression and all of these types of things, and the grief. And it's a beautiful meaning that a person is establishing in this dua, that he is a slave of Allah, the son of the slave of Allah, the son of the female slave of Allah, that we're all slaves of Allah. But in it, as it's mentioned, nasiyati biyadik, my forehead is in the hands of Allah, He's in full control of us. Madin fiyya hukmuk, that means the judgment of Allah is established in me, in my life. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something that makes a person sad, he forgot his keys after he already reached halfway to his destination. He forgot the keys to his place or to his house or whatever there is, and he's so tired. This is the qadr of Allah. You know, it was meant to be this way. He can be depressed about it, but on the other hand, it can be a mean for him to draw himself closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to witness that everything is by the judgment of Allah. It's already happened, right? He did not choose for this to happen, but this is the qadr of Allah. I mean, can be something small, of course, but it can be something major. Death or loss of wealth or whatever there is, a person should witness that this is the ruling of Allah. That's why it brings the closeness to Allah. You know, many people, they let themselves take the path of being, or taking themselves to reach depression. I'm not saying that all kinds of depressions is for a person to neglect it, but many times it can be averted early on. When a person, something bad happens, or in difficult situations or whatever there is, the hearts of the believers are content. They know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakam, that He is the judge subhanahu wa ta'ala, and when there's a ruling, there's a wisdom behind it. That's why the name Al-Hakam and Al-Hakim are always attached to one another, because it's all by the wisdom of Allah. And we are slaves of Allah. And one of the ways to establish this, that removes the grief and the sadness and so on, is to turn to the Quran. That's why in the dua, to make the Quran the spring of our hearts and the light of our chests. So if a person have the Quran as the spring of his heart and the light of his chest, he will see things very clearly. And a person would then have his heart removed from it, all kinds of miseries and so on. So when the Prophet ﷺ said this dua, so in it you say, Madin fiya hukmuk, your hukm is going to be established in me. So you're already accepting this from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they heard the Prophet ﷺ saying that, and they said, should we learn it, O Prophet of Allah? The Prophet ﷺ said, بَلَى يَنْبَغِي لِمَنْ سَمِعَهَا أَنْ يَتَعَلَّمَهَا. It is very important for whoever hears it, that he learns it. So this is, if we take this dua, you know, from this session as a way to establish this name and the belief of it in our hearts, and to benefit from it, that it takes away the grief and the sadness and so on, definitely it's worth it, and it's an authentic dua from the Prophet ﷺ. There are many things to be mentioned, and you know, when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, It's a subject that never ceases, and this is our entire life. But because of the time, we're limited with our time, so we'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala, at this moment. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us benefit from what we heard, and to make us among those who submit themselves to the rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make us obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to purify our hearts with this. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.